Chapter 1. Athens, Before History. Myth, Gods, and the First Settlers. Long before Athens became a city of marble temples, philosophers, and democracy, it was a place of myths whispered by firelight and settlements shaped by survival. To understand Athens, one must begin not with written history, but with legend, because for the ancient Athenians, myth and reality were inseparable. According to tradition, Athens was born from a divine rivalry. The gods themselves competed to claim the city. Poseidon, god of the sea, struck the Acropolis with his trident, summoning a saltwater spring, a symbol of naval power. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, offered an olive tree representing peace, prosperity, and long-term survival. The people chose Athena's gift, believing wisdom and stability were greater than brute force. From that moment, the city bore her name, and her presence shaped Athens for centuries to come. But myth alone does not build cities. Archaeology tells us that humans settled in the region of Athens as early as 3000 BCE, during the Neolithic period. The land was not especially fertile, nor was it rich in natural resources. What it did offer, however, was protection. The Acropolis, a massive limestone hill rising sharply from the plain, provided a natural fortress. From its summit, early inhabitants could see approaching enemies, control nearby routes, and retreat to safety when danger came. These first settlers lived in small communities, relying on farming, herding, and trade with nearby regions. Over time, scattered villages began to unite around the Acropolis, forming the earliest version of Athens. This process, known as Sinoecism, transformed independent clans into a single political and cultural unit. Athens was not born overnight. It was slowly assembled through cooperation, conflict, and necessity. One of the earliest legendary kings of Athens was Cecrops, a half-man, half-serpent figure said to have introduced marriage, burial customs, and laws. Though mythical, Cecrops symbolized a crucial shift, Athens moving from tribal chaos toward organized society. Kingship in early Athens was not absolute tyranny. It was balanced by councils of elders and religious authority. Even in its earliest form, Athens showed signs of shared governance, a quiet preview of what it would later become. During the Bronze Age, Athens fell under the influence of Mycenaean civilization, the same culture associated with heroes of the Trojan War. The massive stone walls were built around the Acropolis, some so large that later Greeks believed only giants could have constructed them. These fortifications reveal a city already concerned with defense and permanence. Athens was no longer just a settlement. It was becoming a power worth protecting. Unlike many Mycenaean centers, Athens did not collapse entirely during the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. While much of the Greek world fell into chaos, Athens survived, albeit weakened. This survival would prove critical. As other regions lost continuity, Athens retained memory of governance, religion, and identity. The centuries that followed are often called the Greek Dark Ages, but for Athens, they were not entirely dark. Writing disappeared, trade declined, and population shrank, yet the city endured. Oral tradition preserved history and myth, passed down through epic poetry and ritual. These stories, of gods, heroes, and ancient kings, became the backbone of Athenian identity. Religion played a central role in early Athenian life. The Acropolis became a sacred space long before its famous temples were built. Shrines, altars, and wooden statues once stood where marble would later rise. Festivals honored the gods, binding the community together through shared belief. Athena was not just a deity, she was the city's protector, moral compass, and symbol of order over chaos. By the 8th century BCE, Athens began to re-emerge from obscurity. Population increased, trade routes reopened, and contact with other Greek communities intensified. Pottery styles evolved, iron tools replaced bronze, and social structures grew more complex. Athens was still ruled by kings, but their power gradually weakened as aristocratic families gained influence. This shift marked a turning point. Power moved away from a single ruler toward elite clans who controlled land, wealth, and religion. These families competed with one another, often violently, but their rivalry also encouraged debate, alliances, and political experimentation. Athens was becoming restless, ready for change. What made Athens different from other Greek cities was not strength or wealth, but adaptability. Its people questioned authority, reshaped traditions, and absorbed new ideas. Geography played a role too. Athens lacked the fertile plains of rival cities, forcing it to rely on trade, craftsmanship, and human skill rather than sheer agricultural output. This necessity bred innovation, and by the end of this early period, Athens was no longer just a place of myths and kings. It was a community bound by shared stories, religious devotion, and an emerging sense of civic identity. The foundations were laid, not for empire yet, but for something far more revolutionary. The city that once chose an olive tree over a weapon was slowly preparing to challenge the very idea of how societies should be ruled. In the next chapter, Athens would take its most daring step, transforming power from the hands of the few into the voice of the many, and in doing so, changing the course of human history forever. Chapter 2. Birth of Democracy. How Athens changed the world. By the early 6th century BCE, Athens was no longer a quiet community bound only by myth and tradition. It was a city under pressure. Population growth, land shortages, and rising inequality had created deep social divisions. Wealthy aristocrats controlled most farmland and political power, while poor farmers struggled under crushing debt. Some Athenians were even forced into debt slavery, losing their freedom to repay what they owed. Tension filled the city and civil war loomed. Athens stood at a crossroads: reform or collapse. The first great attempt to save the city came from Solon, appointed as archon around 594 BCE. Solon was not a radical revolutionary, but he understood that Athens could not survive without change. His reforms aimed to balance justice with stability, tradition with innovation. Solon's most famous act was the Sysactia, the shaking off of burdens. He cancelled debt slavery, freed those already enslaved for debt, and erased existing agricultural debts. This single decision prevented an uprising and restored dignity to thousands of Athenians. Yet Solon went further. He reorganized society into 4 classes based on wealth rather than birth, allowing even lower classes to participate in political life. For the first time, political status was tied to contribution, not ancestry. Still, Solon did not create democracy as we know it. His system was cautious. The wealthy retained significant power, and many citizens felt reforms had not gone far enough. When Solon voluntarily left Athens to avoid being pressured into changing his laws, instability returned. Into that vacuum stepped tyranny. Not tyranny in the modern sense of cruelty, but one-man rule. Pisistratus, a charismatic leader, seized power multiple times before finally securing control. Surprisingly, his rule brought relative peace, and so he supported farmers, promoted trade, and invested in religious festivals. Under him, Athens grew richer and more confident. Yet tyranny was always fragile. After his death, his sons ruled poorly, and resentment grew. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Athenians had learned an important lesson. Neither unchecked aristocracy nor one-man rule could guarantee freedom. The true architect of Athenian democracy emerged in 508 BCE, Cleisthenes. His reforms did something radical. They broke the power of old family loyalties. Instead of organizing citizens by clan, Cleisthenes reorganized Athens into new tribes based on geography. This forced rich and poor, coastal and inland citizens to cooperate politically. At the heart of the new system stood the assembly, where male citizens could speak, debate, and vote directly on laws and policy. Their decisions were no longer whispered in elite chambers. They were argued openly in public spaces. Power became something shared, messy, loud, and collective. Another innovation was the Council of 500, chosen annually by lottery from all tribes. This council prepared laws for the assembly and oversaw daily governance. The use of random selection was revolutionary. It assumed that ordinary citizens were capable of ruling and that power should rotate to prevent corruption. To protect democracy from returning tyranny, Athens introduced ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile any individual deemed a threat to the state. No crime was required, only suspicion of excessive power. Ostracism was harsh, but it reflected a deep fear born from lived experience. Athenians would rather lose a strong leader than lose their freedom. And yet Athenian democracy had limits, serious ones. Only adult male citizens could participate. Women, slaves, and foreigners, who together formed the majority of the population, were excluded. Democracy in Athens was not universal equality. It was a political system designed for a specific group. Still, for those included, it was unprecedented. Never before had ordinary citizens exercised such direct control over their government. Democracy also reshaped Athenian culture. Public speaking became a vital skill. Citizens trained themselves to argue, persuade, and reason. This environment gave birth to philosophy, rhetoric, and critical thinking. Politics was no longer a distant force, it was a daily responsibility. Of course, democracy was not stable by nature. Decisions could be emotional, impulsive, even disastrous. Popular leaders could manipulate crowds. Complex issues were sometimes reduced to slogans. Athens would later pay a heavy price for these weaknesses. But at this moment in history, democracy was not judged by perfection. It was judged by possibility. What made Athens extraordinary was not that it invented voting, but that it trusted citizens with power. It treated participation as a duty, not a privilege. Civic engagement became part of identity. To be Athenian was not just to live in the city, it was to help rule it. By the early 5th century BCE, Athens had transformed itself from a divided aristocratic society into a bold political experiment. Surrounded by monarchies and tyrannies, it stood alone, fragile, noisy, imperfect, but alive with ideas. And soon, those ideas would be tested. External threats were gathering, and Persia was rising in the east. War would force Athens to defend not only its land, but its new way of life. In the next chapter, democracy would meet empire, and Athens would enter its golden age, a period of breathtaking achievement, unmatched brilliance, and dangerous ambition. Chapter 3. The Golden Age of Athens. Power, Art, and Philosophy. When the Persian Wars ended in the early 5th century BCE, Athens emerged transformed. What had once been a fragile experiment in democracy was now a confident power, strengthened by victory and driven by ambition. The destruction left behind by Persian armies, burned temples, shattered homes, and ruined sanctuaries might have broken another city. Instead, Athens used it as fuel. From the ashes rose what history would later call the Golden Age of Athens, and a period of extraordinary achievement in politics, art, architecture, and thought. At the center of this transformation stood Pericles, the most influential leader Athens would ever produce. Pericles did not rule as a king or tyrant. He ruled through persuasion. His power came from his voice, his vision, and his ability to embody democratic ideals while guiding them. Under his leadership, Athens reached heights that no Greek city had ever known. Politically, democracy deepened. Citizens were paid for jury service and public office, allowing even poorer Athenians to participate in governance. This was revolutionary. Politics was no longer the domain of the wealthy. It became the responsibility of the many. Participation in public life was framed as a moral duty. To refuse involvement was not considered peaceful neutrality, but selfishness. Athens also became the head of the Delian League, a coalition of Greek city-states originally formed to defend against Persia. Member states contributed ships or money, and over time, Athens took control of the League's treasury. What began as an alliance slowly turned into an empire. Tribute flowed into Athens, funding fleets, festivals, and monumental building projects. This wealth reshaped the city's skyline. On the Acropolis, where wooden shrines once stood, marble temples began to rise. The most famous of these was the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena. Built with mathematical precision and artistic brilliance, it was more than a temple. It was a statement. The Parthenon proclaimed Athens as the cultural and spiritual leader of the Greek world. Every column, sculpture, and proportion reflected harmony, balance, and human achievement. Art flourished alongside architecture. Sculptors abandoned stiff, idealized forms and began depicting the human body with realism and motion. Painters experimented with depth and perspective. Tragedy and comedy filled theaters, where thousands of citizens gathered to watch stories that explored justice, power, fate, and human weakness. These plays were not mere entertainment, they were public reflections on the nature of society itself. At the heart of this cultural explosion was thought. Athens became a magnet for thinkers, teachers, and students. Among them was Socrates, a man who owned nothing, wrote nothing, yet changed everything. Socrates walked the streets asking uncomfortable questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What makes a good life? He challenged politicians, poets, and craftsmen alike, exposing ignorance where confidence once stood. His method? Dialogue through questioning, turned thinking into an active public act. From Socrates came a lineage of philosophy that would shape Western thought for millennia, including his student Plato, who would later record his ideas and expand them into systematic philosophy. In Athens, thinking was not hidden in temples or palaces. It was debated in marketplaces and gymnasiums. Naval power underpinned all of this brilliance. Athens' fleet dominated the Aegean Sea, protecting trade routes and enforcing imperial authority. The city's walls stretched from the urban center to the port of Piraeus, ensuring access to supplies even during siege. This strategic design made Athens nearly untouchable, as long as its navy ruled the seas. Yet beneath the glow of achievement, tensions grew. Empire brought resentment. Many allied city-states resented Athenian control and tribute demands. Critics warned that democracy at home was being funded by dominance abroad. Athens preached freedom while denying it to others. Even within the city, some feared that popular rule encouraged arrogance and excess. Pericles himself understood the danger. In his famous funeral oration, he praised Athens not for its power, but for its openness, creativity, and love of beauty balanced by discipline. He believed Athens was a model for all humanity, a place where freedom and responsibility could coexist, but ideals are fragile when tested by fear, wealth, and pride. The Golden Age was not an age of peace. It was an age of confidence, perhaps too much confidence. The same system that empowered citizens also allowed emotion to override caution. And the same wealth that funded art and philosophy also sharpened rivalries. Still, for a brief moment in history, Athens achieved something unmatched. It showed what humans could build when given voice, education, and shared purpose. Democracy did not suppress greatness. It unleashed it. Art did not distract from politics. It enriched it. Thought was not dangerous. It was celebrated. The city stood at its peak, admired and envied across the Greek world. But peaks are dangerous places. The higher Athens climbed, the harder the fall would be. In the next chapter, the brilliance of the Golden Age would collide with the brutal reality of war. Pride would meet fear, democracy would face its greatest test, and Athens would learn, at terrible cost, that greatness alone does not guarantee survival. Chapter 4. War, Plague, and Decline. The fall of Athenian power. At the height of its confidence, Athens believed itself unstoppable. Its navy ruled the seas, its walls guarded the land, and its democracy seemed strong enough to withstand any challenge. Yet history is rarely kind to cities at their peak. The same forces that elevated Athens, ambition, pride, and belief in its own exceptionalism, would soon drag it into one of the most devastating conflicts of the ancient world, the Peloponnesian War. The war began in 431 BCE, pitting Athens and its empire against its greatest rival, Sparta. The two powers represented opposite visions of Greek life. Athens was wealthy, naval, democratic, and culturally vibrant. Sparta was land-based, militaristic, oligarchic, and disciplined. For decades, tension between them had simmered beneath the surface. Then when war finally erupted, it was not over a single dispute, but over fear of Athenian dominance. Pericles, still Athens' guiding voice, knew that Sparta's army was superior on land. His strategy was bold but risky. He ordered Athenians to abandon the countryside and shelter behind the city's long walls, relying on naval power to strike Spartan allies while avoiding direct land battles. Athens would wait. Time, money, and sea control were supposed to guarantee victory. At first, the plan worked. Spartan armies ravaged Attica's farmland, but Athens endured. Supplies flowed in through the port of Piraeus. The fleet raided enemy coasts. Democracy held firm. But then disaster arrived, not from Sparta, but from within the walls. In 430 BCE, a deadly plague swept through Athens. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and constant movement of refugees turned the city into a breeding ground for disease. Ancient sources describe fever, sores, blindness, and despair. The sick were abandoned. Laws and customs broke down. Fear replaced faith. An estimated 1/3 of the population died, including soldiers, civilians, and leaders. Among the dead was Pericles. His death marked a turning point. With Pericles gone, Athens lost not just a leader, but a stabilizing force. He had restrained popular impulses, balanced ambition with caution, and understood the limits of democracy. In his absence, power shifted to more aggressive and reckless figures who appealed to emotion rather than reason. The war dragged on year after year. Victory proved elusive. Athens still possessed strength, but its unity was fractured. Political debates grew bitter. Generals were blamed, recalled, even executed. Democracy, once a source of strength, became unstable under pressure. Then came the Sicilian expedition, the greatest gamble in Athenian history. In 415 BCE, convinced that expansion would secure victory, Athens launched a massive naval invasion of Sicily, targeting the city of Syracuse. The plan promised enormous rewards, new allies, resources, and strategic advantage. Critics warned it was overreach, but ambition won the vote. The expedition was a catastrophe. Poor leadership, internal rivalries, and underestimation of the enemy doomed the campaign. The Athenian fleet was trapped. Soldiers were cut off, starved, and slaughtered. Thousands were captured and forced into brutal labor. Almost the entire force was destroyed. The loss shocked the Greek world. Athens had lost ships, men, money, and confidence. So allies revolted. Enemies closed in. Sparta, now supported by Persia, intensified pressure. The war entered its final, brutal phase. Back in Athens, fear and desperation reshaped politics. In 411 BCE, democracy was briefly overthrown by an oligarchic coup, as elites argued that popular rule had failed. Though democracy was later restored, the damage was done. Trust in the system had been shaken. By 404 BCE, Athens was exhausted. Its fleet was destroyed, its walls torn down, and its empire dismantled. Sparta imposed harsh terms and installed a puppet regime known as the 30 Tyrants, whose reign of terror included executions, confiscations, and exile. For the city that once celebrated freedom, this was humiliation. Yet even in defeat, Athens did not entirely collapse. The tyranny was overthrown within a year, and democracy, remarkably, was restored. But it returned changed, more cautious, more aware of its flaws. The dream of empire was over. The Peloponnesian War revealed the darkest truths about Athenian democracy. It showed how fear could overpower reason, how crowds could be manipulated, how success could breed arrogance. But it also revealed something else: resilience. Athens lost power, wealth, and dominance, but it did not lose its identity. Philosophers continued to teach, artists continued to create. Schools of thought survived the ruins of empire. The city that failed to rule Greece would still go on to shape the minds of the world. The Golden Age was finished, but Athens was not dead. In the next chapter, the city would live under foreign rulers, first Macedonian, then Roman. Politically subdued, yet culturally admired, Athens would enter a strange new phase of its history, conquered in body, but unconquered in spirit. Chapter 5: Conquered but not forgotten. Athens under empires. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens was no longer the master of its fate. Its walls had been torn down, its fleet destroyed, and its empire dismantled. Yet history did not erase Athens, it repurposed it. The city that once commanded allies would now endure conquerors, and in doing so, discover a different kind of power, influence without armies. The first new masters came from the north. In the 4th century BCE, Macedon rose rapidly under Philip II. Greek city-states, exhausted by decades of war, could not unite against him. In 338 BCE, Macedon crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Trironia. Greek independence effectively ended. For Athens, the defeat was bitter, but not catastrophic. Philip understood the city's symbolic importance. Rather than destroy it, he preserved its institutions and treated it with measured respect. Athens lost political freedom, but it retained cultural prestige. Democracy survived in a limited form, and the city remained a center of education and philosophy. That status only grew under Philip's son, Alexander the Great. As Alexander launched his astonishing conquests across Asia, Athens watched from the sidelines. It was no longer shaping events, but it was shaping minds. While Alexander built an empire of territory, Athens continued to rule an empire of ideas. Greek language, culture, and philosophy, many of them rooted in Athens, spread across the known world. Ironically, Athens' political weakness protected it. Without an empire to defend, and the city avoided the destructive rebellions that consumed other Greek states. It adapted to a new role, teacher rather than ruler. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured and Athens passed between competing Hellenistic powers. Control changed hands, but the city endured. Its schools flourished, philosophical traditions expanded, Thinkers gathered not to command armies, but to debate truth, ethics, and the nature of reality. It was during this era that philosophical schools became institutions. The Academy, founded by Plato, the Lyceum associated with Aristotle, the Stoa of the Stoics, and the Garden of Epicurus all shaped generations of thinkers. These schools disagreed fiercely, yet together they transformed Athens into the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. Students arrived from distant lands, not to gain power, but to gain wisdom. Then came a new master, more powerful than any before. In the 2nd century BCE, Rome expanded into Greece. Roman armies defeated Macedonian kings and absorbed Greek territories into their growing republic. Athens resisted briefly and paid dearly, suffering siege and destruction in 86 BCE. But once again, the city survived. Rome's relationship with Athens was complex. Militarily, Rome ruled without question. Culturally, however, Rome was in awe. Roman elites admired Greek learning, art, and philosophy. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to Athens to be educated. Emperors funded public buildings, libraries, and monuments. To rule the world, Romans believed one must first understand Greek thought, and Athens was its heart. Under Roman rule, Athens became a museum of greatness, not frozen, but revered. Temples were restored. The philosophical debates continued. The city was no longer innovative in politics, but it remained foundational in culture. Yet even this intellectual freedom had limits. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, traditional pagan institutions faced pressure. By the 4th century CE, Christian emperors increasingly restricted old religious practices. Philosophical schools that once thrived openly were now viewed with suspicion. In 529 CE, Emperor Justinian ordered the closure of pagan philosophical schools, effectively ending a tradition that had lasted nearly 1,000 years. With that decree, Athens' ancient role as the world's foremost center of classical philosophy came to a close. The city faded, not into oblivion, but into obscurity. Under Byzantine rule, Athens became a provincial town, its great monuments repurposed or neglected. The Parthenon was converted into a church. Statues were damaged or removed. The past was still visible, but its meaning had changed. Later, under Ottoman control, Athens shrank further. Travelers described a quiet settlement among ruins, where shepherds grazed animals beside shattered columns. The city that once debated the nature of justice now struggled for survival. And yet, Athens was never truly forgotten. Artists, scholars, and travelers from Europe continued to admire its legacy. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Greek texts. Enlightenment philosophers drew inspiration from Athenian democracy. Even as the city itself slept, its ideas reshaped the modern world. Athens had lost armies, walls, and sovereignty, but it had achieved something far rarer. It had become immortal. Empires conquered Athens, but they could not conquer what it represented. The belief that citizens could govern themselves. That reason mattered. That ideas could outlast power. In the next and final chapter, Athens will awaken once more, rising from centuries of foreign rule to reclaim its place as the capital of a modern nation, carrying the weight of an ancient legacy into the present day. Chapter 6. From ruins to modern capital. Athens reborn. For centuries, Athens existed more as a memory than a power. Its name echoed through philosophy books and political theory, while the city itself slept beneath layers of conquest. Temples became churches, then mosques. Marble columns cracked and fell. Shepherds grazed goats in the shadow of the Acropolis. To outsiders, Athens was a relic, glorious, but finished. History, however, it was not done with Athens. By the early 19th century, Europe was gripped by a new fascination with the ancient world. Poets, artists, and scholars looked back to classical Greece as the birthplace of reason, democracy, and beauty. This intellectual movement, Philhellenism, transformed Athens from a forgotten town into a symbol of freedom waiting to be reclaimed. At the same time, Greece itself was awakening. In 1821, Greeks across the region rose against Ottoman rule in the Greek War of Independence. Though Athens was not the center of early fighting, it soon became strategically important. Battles raged around the Acropolis. Cannons damaged ancient monuments. The Parthenon, already scarred by centuries of misuse, suffered further destruction. Yet for the revolutionaries, Athens meant more than tactics. It meant identity. So when independence was finally secured in the 1830s, the new Greek state faced a defining question: where should its capital be? Athens, at the time, was small, poor, and largely in ruins. Other cities were wealthier and more practical, but symbolism mattered more than convenience. Athens was chosen. The decision was bold and risky. Making Athens the capital meant attempting to resurrect a city that had been dormant for generations. But it also meant anchoring modern Greece directly to its ancient past. The ruins were not obstacles. They were foundations. A massive rebuilding project began. Streets were planned, squares designed, and neoclassical buildings erected to echo ancient ideals. Architects from across Europe helped reshape the city. The Acropolis was cleared of later additions to restore its classical appearance. So Athens was not rebuilt as it once was, but as Europe imagined it should have been. This rebirth came with tension. Modern Athenians lived among ruins that belonged to the world. Preservation often conflicted with daily life. Should the city be a living capital or a historical monument? That question would define Athens for generations. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Athens expanded rapidly. Population grew as people migrated from the countryside. Industry developed, education flourished. The city became the political, cultural, and economic heart of Greece. Then came new trials. The 20th century brought wars, occupation, and hardship. During World War II, Athens suffered famine under Axis control. Thousands died. The city endured not just physical damage, but moral trauma. After liberation, as Greece descended into civil war, and Athens once again stood at the center of national struggle. Yet as it always had, the city survived. Post-war recovery transformed Athens into a modern metropolis. Apartment blocks replaced old neighborhoods. Traffic filled ancient roads. The city grew upward and outward, sometimes at the cost of heritage. Critics feared Athens was losing its soul beneath concrete and pollution. But history has a way of resurfacing. In 2004, Athens hosted the Olympic Games, an event rich with symbolism. The world returned to the birthplace of the Olympics, not to admire ruins, but to witness renewal. Infrastructure improved. Monuments were restored. For a moment, Athens stood proudly at the center of global attention, ancient and modern at once. Today, Athens is a city of contrasts. Cafes sit beside ruins older than most civilizations. Political protests echo through squares once used for ancient assemblies. Tourists photograph the Parthenon while commuters rush to work beneath it. The past is not sealed in museums. It breathes through everyday life. Athens is no longer an empire, and it does not seek to be. Its influence now lies elsewhere. Its legacy lives in ideas that shape the modern world: democracy, citizenship, philosophy, debate, and the belief that power should be questioned. Modern democracies still wrestle with the same problems Athenians faced over 2,000 years ago. How to balance freedom with responsibility, equality with order, passion with reason. Athens did not offer perfect answers. It offered the courage to ask the questions. That is why the city endures. not because of marble temples or military victories, but because it dared to imagine a society ruled by thought rather than force. It failed, it fell, it was conquered, but it never stopped mattering. From myth to democracy, from empire to ruin, from silence to rebirth, Athens has lived many lives. Each layer of its history adds depth to the next. Few cities have shaped humanity so profoundly, and fewer still have survived long enough to witness their own legacy. Athens stands today not as a monument to the past, but as a reminder. Civilizations rise and fall. Power fades, buildings crumble. But ideas, when strong enough, can outlast empires. And in that sense, Athens was never truly conquered. If you enjoyed this complete journey through the history of Athens, from myth and democracy to decline and rebirth, make sure to like the video. Subscribe for more epic history stories and comment below which city's history you want to explore next.